Welcome back to Governing Watch. My name is Jennifer, and today we're going to be talking about what occurred during the first full week of the 119th Congress. So let's go ahead and start with the House resolution. We have House Resolution 192, which is an Amtrak Executive Board Disclosure Act. This was continued from the previous Congress. This requires Amtrak to include information on the base pay and bonuses for certain Amtrak executives. House Resolution 188 was the Amtrak Transparency and Accountability for Passengers and Taxpayers Act. This was a bill that was raised to require that the Amtrak Board of Directors comply with the open meetings requirement in Section 552B of Title V of the United States Code. Really what this means is that they have to have open meetings unless there's a specific reason that is outlined why they can't do so, such as they're having classified information being shared. They are looking into perhaps some criminal investigations, that sort of thing, things that they don't want out in the public. Next, we had House Resolution 152, which is a Federal Disaster Assistance Coordination Act, which really this was to amend the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018 to really develop a study regarding streamlining and consolidating information collection and preliminary damage assessments. So, streamlining the process to be able to get immediate aid. House Resolution 153 is the Post-Disaster Assistance Online Accountability Act. This was to provide an online repository for certain reporting requirements for recipients of federal disaster assistance and for other purposes. House Resolution 164, Power Act of 2005. This was raised to amend the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, which authorizes the federal agencies to provide a certain level of essential assistance for hazard mitigation for electric utilities. House Resolution 144, Tennessee Valley Authority Salary Transparency Act, which was raised to provide that the Federal Reports Elimination and Sunset Act of 1995 does not apply to certain reports required to be submitted by the Tennessee Valley Authority. And finally, last but not least, is House Resolution 189, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission Real Estate Leasing Authority Revocation Act. This was brought forward to eliminate the leasing authority of the SEC. Under the bill, the General Services Administration, the GSA, which is the government's civilian real estate arm, would handle the SEC's real estate acquisitions. This would eliminate having the SEC involved in real estate decisions when the GSA already exists to do the same job. All of these bills are being considered based on the suspension of the rules in the chamber. Under the suspension, any floor debate is limited. All floor amendments are prohibited. So they really can't change those bills in any way. Points of order against the bill are waived, and final passage does require a 2/3 majority vote. These resolutions are being raised because they require spending, and the House Committee on the Budget is looking at the appropriations for them, or trying to determine how much money is going to need to be spent on each of these. The new Congress has placed these resolutions on a short timeline. They need to be considered this week. And you may have noticed that some or most of the resolutions end with "and for other purposes." This means that the bill is covering other things that may not be included in the title. So that is everything that is happening in the House. So let's take a look at the Senate. On Monday, they met to approve their journal entries from the 3rd, and then that was it for them. On Tuesday, they met and brought forward Senate Resolution 16, which is a resolution to constitute the majority party's membership on certain committees for the 119th Congress, or until successors are chosen. So if they're going to be putting new members onto those committees, they need to find those new people. It was submitted to the Senate, considered, and agreed to without an amendment by unanimous consent. The Senate minority followed with Senate Resolution 17, and this was also agreed to unanimously. On Wednesday, they introduced Senate Bill 5 to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to take into custody aliens who have been charged in the United States with theft and for other purposes. This is the bill that's related to Laken Riley, which was passed by the House on the 7th. We didn't talk about it as being, new legislation because this was part of the House Resolution 5 that we talked about last week, which was adopting the rules of the House of Representatives for the 119th Congress. So that was brought over in that pack. And the House passed it in really a very one-sided vote of 264 to 159, with 11 people not voting before they passed it over to the Senate. On Thursday, the Senate brought the vote to the floor to be able to debate this bill. They have to be able to vote on whether or not they're even going to hear this bill coming from the House. So the yay votes were 84, nay votes were 9, and 6 people didn't vote. They also brought Senate Resolution 19, which honored the life and legacy of President Jimmy Carter and commended President Carter for his lifelong career in public service, humanitarian leadership, diplomacy, and courageous advocacy. This was passed unanimously by the Senate, and then the Senate adjourned for the week to resume on Monday. And I wanted to take some time today, before we got too far into this congressional session, to talk about appropriations, which is how we spend money. We know from the first episode where we discussed the powers of Congress, Congress is the branch permitted to spend our tax dollars. An appropriation is a law passed by Congress that provides an agency with a budget. An appropriation allows the agency to incur obligations so they can take on bills, and then they're permitted to make payments on those bills for those specific purposes. One of the things that you start to hear every once in a while is the president will possibly try to stop an appropriation from being given out to maybe particular states. One president who tried to do this was President Nixon. He definitely tried during his administration, but the Supreme Court unanimously voted he could not keep those funds away from the state. Because there are very strict rules for transferring any funds once they've been pledged to a certain bill. This is why sometimes you hear people talking about, well, why couldn't we have spent the money on this instead? This is the reason. Because it takes a lot to be able to have funds moved from one appropriation law to the next. It can be done. Agencies must have specific statutory authorization to move funds between appropriations, or think of appropriations also as being like bank accounts. Statutory authorization for approved funds is provided by authorization and appropriation statutes, which are statutory provisions that define the authority of the federal government to act and provide budget authority. So really what that is saying is that appropriation gives the government the right to provide money for that particular reason. An authorization statute that establishes a federal agency often creates the duties and obligations for that agency, which means if there's a bill that's coming due, even if the authorization time frame expires for that particular agency, the bill still has to be paid, anything that was accumulated towards that agency. There are restrictions for transfer. Transfers are often prohibited or have many more restrictions than maybe retooling an appropriation. Restrictions often include limitations on the amount that can be transferred and the purpose for which the transferred funds can be used. Agencies must typically notify the relevant congressional committees, which are the ones who are sponsoring these bills, before making any transfers, and may face restrictions on when and how they can shift funds between those appropriations to ensure alignment with the original congressional intent for funding. So if the intent was to fund it for one thing, it is very hard to then shift those funds towards something else. It's much easier to say, well, we wanted it to do A, but now we found out about B and we want to fund B instead. That's generally an easier reach for them than to say, hey, I want it for this entirely new statute or agency, and I think that money should all be transferred to there. There's also restrictions. Restrictions on the appropriated funds essentially means that Congress, when allocating money to the government agencies through these bills, specifies strict guidelines on how those funds can be used, including limitations on the purpose of those funds, the amount of the funds, and the time frame for spending, which ensures taxpayer dollars are not only used for authorized purposes and are not misappropriated, but that the restrictions on the spending keeps us on budget. So we're not going beyond the allocated amounts and the allotted timeframes for which these funds can be enforced. And kind of going back to the president for just a minute, the president does not have the authority to directly allocate funds. Instead, it can only spend money that has been appropriated by Congress. A lot of times you'll see this during like disaster relief, where you see that the president has released particular funds to those disasters. We're seeing that right now with the LA fires. And also it really does reiterate that the president can't delay the funds. He can never stop the funds, but he can't even really delay those funds without congressional oversight. There's recently been a lot of discussion about the budget, which was passed with a continuing resolution for a few months while the new Congress is getting settled and starting to make decisions on the budget. Anytime that the budget comes forward, if there's not either a budget being passed or a continuing resolution, the government shuts down. There's also at times conversation about how money is spent, both domestically and internationally, and why it's not spent on something else. As we talked about last week, money can't be spent without a bill. And changing how it is spent based on our discussion from earlier is very difficult. Once it is put in the account or appropriated, it is extremely difficult to shift those assets, and it has to be done through new legislation. I hope that this information was helpful as we move forward into this Congress, and we're definitely going to be talking about appropriations and budgeting more and more as we encounter more of these bills. But I am very excited. We are entering into another week, and we're going to see what other bills and resolutions are going to be introduced. If some of the ones that we've talked about are going to be passed and made into law. And as always, if during any of these videos you become concerned about a bill or a resolution, you need to reach out to your representative or your senator. This is the only way for your voice to be heard about these topics, and these topics do impact your life. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave comments down below. I want to thank you for joining me on this episode of Governing Watch, and we'll see you next week.